The difference between static and dynamic stretching gets discussed quite a bit, and basically there's two ways to think about it. Static stretching is the traditional type of movement where you touch your toes and you hold it for 30 seconds or so. So there's really no movement happening, it's a static position. Dynamic flexibility is sort of the opposite. You're increasing your range of motion, so the muscles being lengthened, but there's constant movement. So you've got to think about movements such as lunges or skips or different positions where the body goes through elongating the muscle, so lengthening the muscle, but there's force being produced at the same time, so they're stretching and strengthening at the same time period. So that's the two major differences between static stretching and dynamic stretching. So static stretching, there's been a lot of research over the last decade or so looking at how it affects physical performance if you do static stretching immediately before exercise. And that time window has been shown to be about an hour or so. So if you're doing static stretching before tennis practice or before a physical training session, you're going to actually see a reduction in strength, speed and power for about an hour after you do that static stretching activity. So it's highly recommended not to do that before activity, but to actually perform it after you do your training sessions or in the evening. So flexibility is really important, but understanding what types to use at the right times is even more important. So there's a couple reasons why. It's got to do, partly to do with this concept of muscle stiffness. So by stretching it statically, you reduce the muscle stiffness. And by reducing muscle stiffness, every time you take a ground contact, every time there's force being produced, there's not as much force going back up through the body. So that's the problem. When you do static stretching, you do increase the range of motion, but you're actually losing your ability to produce force. And as we know, force is one of the big aspects of power. So if we reduce force, we're not going to be as powerful, we're not going to be as fast. And in tennis, that's not a good thing. We want to make sure that we stay fast and powerful as much as we can. So when you're performing static stretching, there's a few different ways that it can be performed. There's a lot of different methodologies around stretching now, but the traditional stretching where you're trying to increase range of motion in a safe environment for an athlete is usually trying to hold the stretches for about 30 seconds to a minute. So you'd go through all the major body parts, you try to hold the stretches in a constant position for about 30 seconds to a minute, then you would relax, and then you would try to increase the length a little bit more and repeat that anywhere from 2 to 5 times depending on the level that you're at. The literature is pretty clear here. We want to mimic our movements from an energy system standpoint, similar to what a tennis athlete has to do. We know that most points last less than 10 seconds. We know our rest periods are between 20 and 30 seconds. So we should be doing our tennis conditioning sessions somewhat in that range. We know that the longest point a player will play probably won't go much more than 45 seconds to a minute max at any time. So there's no real need to do activities that go longer than that from a training standpoint. The other thing is a lot of people like very long runs sometimes, and running a few miles is not a bad thing. Tennis players should be able to run a few miles, 5 kilometers. It should be doable, but anything longer than that doesn't really transfer that well to tennis because it's not high intensity. They're running at a relatively slow pace, whereas it would be much more preferable to do more high intensity sort of sprint interval type training sessions where the athlete goes pretty hard for 20 or 30 seconds, then recovers, then does that again, and does that over an extended period of time. So that's sort of a tennis-specific endurance program.